16 confirmed impacts, the investigator said, tapping the glossy printout. 1,090 meters, 88 seconds. With a rifle zeroed for a man 6 inches taller and 40 pounds heavier than you, Lieutenant Katja Maes didn't look at the photo. She looked at the scars on her knuckles. The wind was holding steady, sir. That's not the point, Lieutenant. The SEALs are calling it a statistical anomaly. Command is calling it a massacre. The investigator leaned in, the fluorescent hum of the interrogation room suddenly loud. Chief Miller's affidavit says you took his weapon without authorization while he was incapacitated. He claims he waved you off. Katja finally looked up. Her eyes were dry, rimmed with the exhaustion of 3 days without sleep. Miller was bleeding out. The HVT was moving. If I hadn't taken that rifle, there wouldn't be an affidavit. There would just be body bags. The report says you hesitated. I was calculating the drop, Katja said softly. Whatever the report says, I didn't miss. 5 hours earlier, Extraction Point Delta, the humid air inside the TOC, Tactical Operations Center, smelled of ozone, burnt coffee, and aggressive masculinity. Lieutenant Katja Maes stood near the map table, her hands clasped behind her back, trying to occupy as little space as possible while still appearing present. She was the only woman in the room, and the only one wearing the distinct jigsaw camouflage of the Belgian Defense Forces. Who's babysitting the tourist? The voice belonged to Master Chief Jonas Miller. He didn't look up from the satellite imagery, but the question was projected loud enough to cut through the hum of the radios. He was a slab of a man, beard graying at the roots, with forearms thick enough to choke a horse. That would be liaison officer, Master Chief, Katja said, her English crisp, accented only slightly by the Flemish clipped vowels. And I don't require babysitting. Miller finally looked up. His eyes were pale blue and utterly devoid of warmth. He scanned her, from the boots that were too clean, to the patch on her shoulder, to the suppressed FN scar L resting against the wall behind her. He smirked. SFG, Miller read the patch. Special Forces Group. You guys handle the chocolates and the waffles, right? Or is that the Swiss? A ripple of laughter went through the gathered SEALs. It wasn't malicious, exactly. It was the exclusionary laughter of a tribe testing an outsider. We handle the intelligence that keeps you from walking into a kill box, Katja replied, keeping her voice even. The coordinates for the HVT in Sector 4 came from my team. Your team sits in Brussels staring at screens, Miller said, turning back to the map. We're the ones who have to bleed for it. Command says you're attached for operational continuity. I say you're baggage. You stay in the rear vehicle. You don't speak on the net unless you're dying or you see Jesus. Clear? Crystal, Katja said. Miller walked over to her gear pile. He nudged her rifle case with the toe of his boot. And this? What is this plastic toy? FN SCAR 556, she said. Standard issue. We run MK-18s and 416s, Miller said. Your mags aren't compatible with my guys. If you run dry, you're a paperweight. And that optic. He pointed to the high magnification variable scope she had mounted. You planning on shooting fleas off a dog's ass? We're going into a dense urban ruin. Engagement distances are 50 meters max. That glass is a liability. It glints. It allows for reconnaissance, Katja argued, her pulse ticking up. Information gathering. Miller shook his head. It violates our light discipline protocols. The reflection risk is too high. He held out a hand. Pop it off. Iron sights or a red dot, Lieutenant. Or you don't step outside the wire. It was a hazing ritual. She knew it. The scope had a kill flash filter. It wouldn't glint. But arguing logic with a master chief in front of his platoon was a losing battle. If she fought him on the gear, he'd bench her entirely. Katja swallowed her pride. She picked up the rifle, unlocked the mount levers, and slid the expensive glass off the rail. She set it on the table with a heavy clack. "Happy?" she asked. "Ecstatic," Miller said, not looking at it. "Gear up, boys. We step off at 200, and Lieutenant, try not to trip over the intel." Katja moved to the corner to check her plate carrier. As she tightened the straps, she watched Miller meticulously cleaning his own weapon. A Mk-13 Mod 7 sniper rifle, a beast of a gun chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum. He treated it with a tenderness he clearly didn't extend to human beings. "Nice rifle," she murmured as she passed him. Miller didn't look up. "Don't even look at it, Bruges. You touch this weapon, and you'll lose a hand." "Bruges? Just that's where you're from, right? Like the movie?" Miller racked the bolt. "In Bruges. It's a fairy tale town. Stay in the fairy tale, Lieutenant. The real world bites." Katja checked her magazine, the spring stiff against her thumb. She was entering a war zone with a stripped rifle and a team that wanted her gone. She looked at Miller's heavy sniper rifle one last time, a premonition shivering down her spine. "Understood, Chief," she said. The silence that followed a concession often carried more weight than the argument itself. Katja felt the shift in the room's air pressure. Not acceptance, but a temporary suspension of hostility, bought at the price of her tactical autonomy. As she looked at the empty rail on her rifle, the metal cold and naked under the harsh lights, she realized Miller hadn't just taken her scope. He had taken her ability to see the threats before they arrived. She was walking into the dark blind, led by men who confused caution with cowardice, and she knew, with the heavy, sour dread of experience, that the cost of their arrogance would eventually land on her desk, or her conscience. The world through the phosphorus green of night vision goggles was a flat, deceptive place. Depth perception was a lie told by technology, and every shadow looked like a crater. Katja sat in the rear jump seat of the second ground mobility vehicle, her knees knocking against a stack of Pelican cases with every lurch of the suspension. The convoy was running black. No headlights, no IR floods, just the passive amplification of starlight and the driver's nerves. "Rear Vic, close it up!" Miller's voice crackled over the inter-team radio, bypassing the long-range comms. "You're lagging, Bruges. Don't make me put you on a leash." Katja didn't key her mic. She tapped the driver's shoulder, signaling him to accelerate. The driver, a young petty officer named Davis, grunted and floored it. The engine whined, struggling for purchase in the loose shale of the dry riverbed. The road, on the satellite imagery she had provided, was supposed to be hard-packed dirt. In reality, it was a graveyard of industrial debris and shifting scree. "Intel said this route was clear," Davis muttered, wrestling the wheel. "Intel is 3 months old," Katja replied, her eyes scanning the ridgeline through her monocular. "The rains changed the topography." "Tell that to the chief," Davis said. Then the world turned white. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a visual erasure. The explosion bloomed directly under the front right tire, a violent, overexposed flash that overwhelmed the auto-gating on Katja's NVGs. The green tube flared into a blinding, solid sheet of brightness, searing her retina. The physics arrived a split second later. The vehicle bucked violently, the front end lifting like a breaching whale before twisting in the air. Katja was thrown against the roll cage, the breath driven from her lungs by the impact of the ceramic plates in her carrier. The world spun, sky, dirt, metal, sky, before slamming down with a bone-jarring crunch, Silence followed, heavy and ringing. Katja gasped, sucking in air that tasted of pulverized rubber and cordite. She ripped the NVG assembly off her helmet, blinking tears from her eyes to clear the blindness. The vehicle was on its side. Red emergency lights bathed the interior in a hellish glow. "Davis!" she rasped. "I'm good," the driver groaned from the front, hanging in his harness. "I'm good. Just rung." Katja unclipped her belt and dropped to the sidebar, scrambling out the back hatch which had popped open on impact. She tumbled onto the cold stones of the riverbed, hand instinctively going to the rifle slung across her chest. She pulled it forward. The stock was shattered. The receiver twisted at a 45-degree angle where the Pelican case had smashed into it during the roll. The barrel was bent like a reed. "Perimeter!" Miller was shouting, his voice not on the radio but live, cutting through the dark. "Fan out! 360 security!" The SEALs from the lead vehicle were already moving, ghostly shapes in the starlight, weapons raised. There was no follow-up ambush, no tracer fire from the ridges, just an old mine, forgotten in the mud, waiting for a tire. Miller marched over to the wreck, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel. He shined a red-filtered light into the cab, checking Davis, then swung the beam to Katja. She was kneeling, staring at the useless metal in her hands. "Casualties?" Miller demanded. "Negative," Katja said, standing up. Her ribs throbbed, a dull ache that promised to turn sharp later. "Vehicle is a mobility kill. Axle is gone." Miller looked at her weapon. The red light played over the twisted receiver of the SCAR. "That your primary?" "It was." "Told you it was plastic," Miller spat. He turned his head, scanning the dark horizon. "We can't call this in. MCON is still in effect. If we break squelch to call for a tow, we alert every listener in the valley that we're here. We are 3 clicks from the target. We proceed on foot," Katja said. It wasn't a question. "We proceed," Miller corrected. You're dead weight without a long gun." "I have my sidearm," Katja said, her hand brushing the grip of the FN-57 on her hip. "And I have the intel on the infiltration point. You still need me to verify the target building." Miller stared at her. The red light made his eyes look like hollow sockets. He weighed the options. Abort the mission and drag a broken vehicle back, or leave the wreck, camouflage it, and push on. He was a hunter. He wouldn't turn back. "Strip the comms and the sensitive items," Miller ordered the team. "We hump it from here. Lieutenant, you stay in the center of the formation. You don't engage, you don't scout. You try to look like a shadow. If we get into a TIC, troop in contact, you find a hole and you stay in it. You understand? You are effectively a non-combatant." Katja dropped the broken rifle. It clattered on the stones, a sound that felt like a surrender. "Understood. Move out," Miller whispered. They moved into the darkness, the SEALs moving with the fluid grace of predators. Katja fell into line, the weight on her chest gone, leaving her feeling dangerously light. Her hand rested on the pistol grip, a small comfort against the vastness of the hostile night. She was walking into a war zone armed with little more than a badge and a prayer, surrounded by men who viewed her survival as an administrative burden rather than a tactical priority. There is a specific kind of nakedness that comes from losing your primary weapon in hostile terrain. It is not just the loss of firepower, but the loss of the physical barrier between the self and the violence. As Katja marched, the phantom weight of the rifle lingered on her sling, a ghost limb that twitched with every snapped twig. She realized then that credibility in this world was measured in caliber and range, and by stripping her of both, the night had reduced her from a soldier to a witness. She tightened her grip on the pistol, the polymer handle slick with sweat, and made a silent vow that if she had to use it, she would not be the one finding a hole to hide in. The path ahead narrowed, forcing them single file toward the decaying silhouette of the city, where the shadows waited to see what she was made of. The city didn't just smell of rot. It smelled of wet rust and ancient, settled dust. They called the building the Skeleton, an 8-story residential block that had been shelled halfway to oblivion during the separatist uprisings and left to cure in the chemical rain. It was the highest point in the sector, commanding a direct line of sight into the warlord's compound 300 meters to the east. Getting to the top was an exercise in silent agony. The elevators were tombs. The stairwells were choked with rubble. They climbed the exposed rebar and shattered concrete of the elevator shaft, hand over hand, in pitch darkness. Katja moved with a grim efficiency. Without the weight of her rifle and plate-heavy combat loadout, she was lighter than the SEALs, pulling herself up the rusted ladder rungs with fluid, deliberate movements. Below her, she could hear the heavy, suppressed breathing of Master Chief Miller. The Mk-13 sniper rifle strapped to his back was a cumbersome giant, the barrel snagging on twisted wire, the suppressor clanking softly against the concrete despite his efforts to cushion it. "Watch your step," she whispered, pointing to a section of floor that had crumbled away to reveal a 40-foot drop. "Maintain silence," Miller hissed back, sweating through his cam paint. He freed his ghillie hood from a jagged piece of rebar with a rip of fabric. "I know how to climb stairs, Lieutenant." They reached the 8th floor, or what was left of it. The wind whipped through the missing walls, carrying the scent of burning trash from the shanties below. The sniper team, Miller and his spotter, a lanky petty officer named Tex, lowered their gear into the corner of a room that offered a jagged keyhole view of the target building. Katja stayed back, pressing herself into the shadows of a load-bearing pillar. She felt phantom cramps in her hands, the muscle memory reaching for a foregrip that wasn't there. She unclipped her binoculars. If she couldn't shoot, she would see. "Setting up," Tex whispered, unfolding the tripod for the spotting scope. "Wind is 3/4 value, left to right. Maybe 5 miles an hour." Miller settled into the prone position, the heavy rifle extending toward the gap in the wall. He adjusted the objective lens, his breathing slowing to a rhythmic trance. "Target building is dark. I have 2 sentries on the north wall. Smoking. Weapons slung." Katja brought her own binoculars up. The glass was good, German-made, but it wasn't a weapon sight. She scanned the perimeter of the warlord's compound, the high walls, the razor wire, the courtyard where the assault team would breach in 20 minutes. Then she saw it. It wasn't movement. It was the absence of background. On the roof of a textile factory adjacent to the compound, in a chaotic pile of industrial piping, a shadow was too geometric. A straight line where there should have been a curve. She focused, straining her eyes against the grain of the image intensification. The line shifted. A barrel. A localized darkening behind it. A hide. "Miller," she whispered, crawling forward on her elbows. "Sector 3, the textile roof near the ventilation stack." "Busy," Miller murmured, tracking a sentry. "Check it," she insisted, her voice tight. "Counter-sniper. I see a barrel." Miller sighed, a sound of profound irritation. "Tex?" Tex slewed the big spotting scope to the left. "Sector 3, textile roof, looking." He paused. "I got pipes, trash, HVAC units. Nothing heat sig. He's under a thermal blanket," Katja said. "Look at the geometry. That shadow is artificial." "I don't see it, Bruges," Tex said, panning back. "Thermal is cold. If there's a guy there, he's a statue. We're burning time. Assault team is at the breach point." He's waiting for the breach, Katja said, a cold spike of certainty driving into her stomach. He's watching the choke point. Miller, if you don't neutralize him, the assault team walks into a crossfire. Miller didn't move his eye from his scope. I have no positive ID. I am not taking a blind shot into a civilian industrial zone based on a geometric shadow from the peanut gallery. My ROE is strict. Weapon on safe until I see a weapon. He has a weapon! You see a line, Miller corrected. Could be a pipe, could be a broomstick. Shut it down, Lieutenant. That's an order. Katja stared at the roof. She knew what she saw. She knew the patience of a sniper who waits for the chaos to start. But the 5.7 on her hip had an effective range of 50 meters. The target was 400 meters away. She was mathematically impotent. Breach in 5, the radio crackled in her earpiece. She watched the shadow on the textile roof. It didn't move. It waited. And because she had no rifle, no voice in the hierarchy, and no way to prove the invisible, she had to sit in the dust and wait for the dying to start. Breach in 3, Miller relayed. 2, 1. Below them, in the distance, a muffled thump signaled the charge blowing the compound doors. The night erupted in small arms fire, and on the textile roof, the shadow shifted. The helplessness of the observer is a specific kind of torture, distinct from the fear of the participant. It is the agony of possessing the truth, but lacking the kinetic authority to enforce it. Katja watched the distant roof through her binoculars, her knuckles white, witnessing the validation of her judgment in the worst possible way. She wasn't vindicated. She was complicit by proximity. As the first tracers from the hidden enemy position stitched into the courtyard below, slicing toward the team she was supposed to protect, she understood that in this trade, being right meant nothing if you couldn't pull the trigger. The silence of her missing rifle screamed louder than the gunfire, a void where a decision should have been. The radio chatter dissolved from disciplined brevity into a cacophony of urgent shouting in less than 3 seconds. Contact front, contact left, taking effective fire from the high ground. Down in the courtyard, 400 meters away, the green phosphorescence of the battle was ripped apart by the distinct, high-velocity crack of the counter-sniper's rifle. Through her binoculars, Katja watched the lead breacher of the assault team crumple as if his strings had been cut. He hit the dirt just inside the compound gate, his legs twitching once before going still. Man down! Man down! Viper is hit! Miller! Katja screamed, dropping the binoculars and grabbing the spotter's shoulder. That's the textile roof. He has the angle on the gate. Miller was already traversing, cursing a steady stream of profanity as he fought the heavy M13 against the friction of the concrete floor. I can't see the flash. Where is he? Behind the vent stack. He's shooting through the gap. Before Miller could settle the crosshairs, the trap's second jaw snapped shut. From the second story of the main villa, the heavy, rhythmic thumping of a DSHK heavy machine gun began. The sound was unmistakable, a deep, resonant doof 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 that punched through the night air and vibrated in Katja's chest. The 12.7mm rounds chewed through the courtyard's mud brick walls like they were wet paper, pinning the seals in the fatal funnel of the entryway. Heavy weapon! Heavy weapon! The voice on the radio was breathless, bordering on panic. We are pinned! We can't move! Sniper, suppress that gun! I'm on it, Miller roared. He shifted his aim away from the textile roof, prioritizing the heavy machine gun that was currently shredding his team's cover. He exhaled, his body going rigid. Crack. The bolt cycled. The brass casing pinged off the wall. Impact! Tex called out, his voice trembling slightly. You hit the shield. Gunner is still up. Adjusting, Miller growled. Yeah, Miller, the sniper! Katja yelled. He's still active. He's going to flank them. One target at a time, Bruges, Miller shouted without looking up. He fired again. This time, the DSHK went silent for a heartbeat, then resumed its hammering rhythm. Civilian shields, Tex reported. They're pushing women into the courtyard. We can't frag the nest. The chaotic tableau below was a nightmare of tactical geometry. The SEALs were stuck behind a low retaining wall, taking fire from 2 elevations. They couldn't advance because of the machine gun. They couldn't retreat because of the sniper. And they couldn't use grenades because the warlord had flooded the kill zone with non-combatants. I have the shot, Miller muttered, his finger tightening on the trigger again. I have the air in the room displaced violently. It wasn't a sound Katja heard, but a wet, sickening thud, followed instantly by the supersonic snap of the bullet passing through the room. Miller's head snapped back. A spray of dark mist painted the peeling wallpaper behind him. He collapsed forward over the rifle, his body sliding sideways off the stock. Chief! Tex scrambled backwards, slipping in the dust. Katja didn't scramble. She lunged. She hit Miller's chest, grabbing his plate carrier and dragging him back from the exposure of the window. Tex! Pressure! Now! Miller was alive, but it was bad. The round, from the counter-sniper on the textile roof, the one Katja had seen, the one Miller had ignored, had struck him in the junction of the neck and shoulder, bypassing the ceramic plate. The arterial blood was bright red and pumping in spurts that matched his frantic heartbeat. "What medic?" Tex screamed into the radio. "Eagle is down! Eagle is down! We need a medic at the overwatch!" "No medic is coming up here, Tex," Katja snapped, ripping the med kit from Miller's belt. Her hands were slippery with his blood immediately. "Pack the wound. Push the gauze in. Harder!" Miller's eyes were wide, fixed on the ceiling, glazed with shock. He gurgled, trying to speak, his hand flailing weakly, gripping Katja's wrist with a strength that was fading fast. "My rifle," he choked out, blood bubbling past his lips. "Forget the rifle," Katja ordered, jamming a wad of combat gauze into the cavity of his shoulder. He groaned, a guttural sound of agony. "Assault team to overwatch!" The radio crackled, the voice desperate. "We are taking casualties. 2 more down. That DSHK is chewing us up. Where is the suppression? Fire! Fire now!" Katja looked up from the crimson mess of Miller's neck. Tex was staring at her, his hands covered in blood, his face pale green in the reflected light of the comms gear. He looked at the window, then at Miller, then at Katja. He was a spotter. He wasn't a shooter. He didn't have the training to make a 1,000-meter shot under stress. "We can't," Tex whispered into the radio, his voice breaking. "Shooter is down. We are ineffective." "You have to engage!" the assault leader screamed. "They are flanking us. We're going to die down here." Katja looked at the MK-13 lying in the dust. The barrel was still hot. The optic was dialed for the DSHK. The counter-sniper on the textile roof was racking up kills. The machine gun was turning the courtyard into a slaughterhouse. And the only person left in the room who knew how to calculate wind and ballistics was holding a piece of bloody gauze. Panic is a chemical flood, but training is the dam that holds it back. As Katja pressed her weight onto Miller's wound, feeling the heat of his life trying to escape, she realized the chain of command had effectively dissolved into the concrete floor. There was no officer, no enlisted, no Belgian or American. There was only the geometry of the kill box and the physics of the solution. She looked at the rifle, the forbidden, heavy man's weapon, and saw it not as a tool of exclusion, but as the only lever left to stop the world from ending. The choice wasn't between obeying orders and breaking them. It was between silence and survival. The screaming on the radio didn't stop, and neither did the blood. The radio didn't just scream, it wept. The sounds coming through the earpiece were the chaotic, jagged noises of men realizing they were about to die. Guttural commands, the wet smack of bullets hitting meat, and the relentless, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the DSHK dismantling their cover. "We are combat ineffective!" The assault leader's voice cracked, distorted by static and gunfire. "Where is the fucking sniper? Miller, drop the hammer or we are gone!" Katja looked down at her hands. They were soaked in Master Chief Miller's blood, a hot, sticky crimson that coated her fingers and pooled on the concrete dust. Beneath her palms, Miller was fighting a losing battle with gravity. His eyes were rolling back, his skin turning the color of wet ash, but his right hand was still clamped onto the sling of his MK-13 rifle with the hysterical strength of the dying. "Tex," Katja barked, her voice cutting through the ringing in the room. "Take over pressure. Now." Tex stared at her, his eyes wide and unseeing. He was in the freeze response, his brain unable to process the jump from observer to medic. "Tex!" Katja grabbed his vest and yanked him forward, slamming his knees into the dust beside Miller. She grabbed the spotter's hands and forced them into the wound channel, burying his fingers in the warm, ruined flesh of his chief's neck. "Push. If you let go, he bleeds out in 30 seconds. Do you understand?" Tex nodded frantically, his breathing jagged. "I got him. I got him." Katja pulled away, her hands slick. She turned to the rifle. It lay on its side where Miller had fallen, a tan-painted precision instrument that looked alien in the filth of the ruin. It was a MK-13 Mod 7, chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum, a round designed to stop vehicles, let alone men. It was heavy, long, and set up for a man with a length of pull 3 inches longer than hers. She reached for the pistol grip. No, the groan came from the floor. Miller, despite the massive trauma, was fighting through the shock. His eyes fluttered open, fixing on her hand touching his weapon. It was a primal territorialism drilled into him by decades of doctrine. "This is my rifle." "Don't," Miller gasped, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "Not authorized." "You're out of the fight, Jonas," Katja said, her voice low and hard. She wasn't asking. She grabbed the forend and the grip. Miller's left hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. His grip was surprisingly weak, slippery with his own blood, but the intent was violent. "You can't shoot. You'll miss." "If I don't shoot, they all die," Katja said. She ripped her arm free. The motion was violent, disrespectful, and necessary. Miller's hand flopped back onto the concrete, leaving a smear of red on her forearm. He let out a sound that was half sob, half curse, and then his eyes rolled back as the hypovolemic shock finally dragged him under. Katja didn't look back. She dragged the heavy rifle to the window ledge. The bipod leg scraped against the stone. She settled the stock into her shoulder and immediately felt the mismatch. The cheek weld was too high, the stock was too long. She had to crawl forward, straining her neck to get a clear sight picture, her body contorted around the weapon rather than melding with it. She wiped the blood from her trigger finger onto her pant leg, leaving a dark streak on the fabric, and reached for the scope turrets. "Tex, give me the dope," she ordered, bringing her eye to the glass. "What?" Tex's voice was a whimper. "The dope!" she screamed. "Data on previous engagement! What is the hold for the courtyard? What is the wind?" I don't," Tex stammered. Miller had it. It's on his armband. There was no time to check the armband. No time to do the math. Katja looked through the scope. The reticle was a complex Christmas tree of hash marks and dots. The image danced slightly with her own adrenaline. Down in the courtyard, the scene was a massacre in slow motion. The DSHK in the villa window was flashing rhythmically, chipping away the wall hiding the surviving seals. On the textile roof to the left, she saw the counter-sniper shift, lining up a shot on a medic dragging a wounded man. She was shooting a stranger's gun with a stranger's zero at a target over a kilometer away. With wind she hadn't measured and lives she was responsible for. Trust the glass. Trust the physics. She racked the bolt. The action was smooth, heavy, mechanical. She loaded a round into the chamber. "Assault team, this is Overwatch," Katja said into the comms, her voice dropping an octave, becoming dead flat. "Stand by." "Who is this?" the frantic voice cracked back. "Where is Miller?" "Miller is down," Katja said. She exhaled, forcing her heart rate to slow, forcing the tremors in her hands to still. She centered the crosshairs on the muzzle flash of the DSHK, holding slightly left for the wind she could feel on her cheek. "This is Bruges. I have control." She didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait for the inevitable protest. She applied pressure to the trigger, feeling the wall, and squeezed. The recoil of the 300 Win Mag was a mule kick against her collarbone, far more violent than her light carbine. The rifle bucked, the scope blacking out for a fraction of a second. But even before the image returned, before the sound of the shot echoed off the canyon walls of the dead city, she knew. The transfer of authority hadn't happened with a signature or a salute. It had happened the moment she chose to steal the weapon that could save them, accepting the weight of the recoil and the weight of the sin in the same bruise. The rifle was no longer borrowed. It was hers, bought with blood that wasn't her own. The DSHK gunner didn't just die. He evaporated from the window frame. Through the high magnification optic, Katja saw the result of the 300 Winchester Magnum round impacting the man's chest cavity. The heavy machine gun tilted crazily on its pintle mount, silenced instantly. There was no time to process the violence. The clock in her head was already ticking. 1. "Target down," she whispered, her voice detached, barely audible over the ringing in her ears. She worked the bolt. It was stiff, the action gritty with dust, requiring a sharp, aggressive yank to eject the spent brass. The casing clattered against the wall, steaming. "Counter-sniper, textile roof," she muttered to herself. She shifted the heavy rifle left. The bipod legs dragged on the concrete, a jarring vibration that blurred her sight picture. She settled. The geometric shadow she had argued about earlier was now clearly a man, scrambling to reposition behind the HVAC unit. He knew he'd been made. He was moving fast. At 1 through 90 meters, the flight time of the bullet was nearly 1.5 seconds. If she aimed where he was, she would miss by 3 meters. She had to aim at empty air, into the future where he would be. Lead him. 2 mils left, 1 mil high. She didn't look at the dope card. She didn't check the Kestrel wind meter. She let the image of the reticle float over the gray landscape, trusting the neurological feedback loop between her eye and her finger. Crack. The rifle slammed into her shoulder again, the recoil pad digging into the bruise forming there. Through the scope, she saw the trace, a distortion in the air like a heat shimmer, arc across the distance. It intersected the running figure. The man spun violently and dropped behind the vent stack. 2. "Sniper down," Katja broadcast. "Status?" "Taking fire from the east wall," the assault leader screamed. The panic slightly abated, but the urgency dialed up. "They're flanking. 5 to 6 packs in the open. Danger close!" Katja panned the rifle right. She saw them. A squad of fighters was sprinting across the open gap in the courtyard wall, moving to get a side angle on the pinned seals. If they reached the rubble pile, they would have enfilade fire on the entire American team. She had 3 rounds left in the magazine. There were 6 targets. "Tex, mags!" she yelled, not taking her eye off the scope. "What?" "Magazines! On Miller's vest! Pull them!" She fired. The lead runner dropped. 3. She racked the bolt. The motion was becoming fluid now, a rhythmic violence. Rack, push, breath, squeeze. The second runner dove for cover but was too slow. The round caught him in the hip. 4. She fired again. A miss. The bullet kicked up dirt inches from the third man's head. He froze, confused by the thunder coming from the high rise. "Dry!" she screamed. "Tex!" A polymer magazine slapped into her open palm. Tex was shaking, his face smeared with Miller's blood, but he was moving. He was feeding the machine. Katja slammed the fresh mag into the well and racked the bolt. The recoil was starting to numb her shoulder, turning the pain into a dull, distant thud. She wasn't Katja Maes anymore. She wasn't a lieutenant. She was a biological interface for the weapon system. The world narrowed down to the crosshairs. The morality of the act, the fact that she was ending human lives with the mechanical indifference of a hole punch, was suspended. There was no room for conscience in the math of ballistics. 5, 6, 7. The flankers were pinned. They stopped moving, diving behind the low debris. But pinned wasn't enough. They were still combat effective. "They're digging in," the radio crackled. "Suppress them." Suppressing, Katja lied. She didn't suppress. She eliminated. She found a rhythm that defied the manual. The Mk-13 was a bolt-action precision rifle, not a semi-automatic battle rifle. It was designed for slow, deliberate fire. Katja drove it like a stolen car. She fired, cycled, and fired again before the echo of the first shot had died in the alleyways. 8, 9. A fighter popped up with an RPG. Katja put the crosshair on his center mass. The wind gusted. She saw a piece of trash flutter in the scope. She held right edge. 10. The RPG tube flew into the air. The man did not get up. "Reload!" Tex handed her another mag. His eyes were huge, staring at her as if she were a monster. Maybe she was. She was sweating, the salt stinging her eyes, her hair matted against her cheek. She could smell the propellant, the copper, and the iron scent of the blood on the floor. She cleared the courtyard, then the balcony, then the gate. When the bolt clicked on an empty chamber for the 4th time, silence rushed back into the world. It was heavy and sudden. The DSHK was silent. The textile roof was empty. The courtyard was still. "Overwatch! This is assault!" The voice on the radio was breathless, confused. "Status of threats?" Katja lowered her forehead onto the scope rings, gasping for air. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at the timestamp on her watch. 88 seconds. "Threats neutralized," Katja rasped, her throat raw. "Sector clear." There is a specific, narcotic quality to extreme competence in a crisis, a flow state where the brain bypasses fear and accesses a cold, predatory algorithm. For those 88 seconds, Katja had ceased to be a person. She had become the consequence of her training. But as the adrenaline receded, leaving her trembling in the dust with a rifle that didn't belong to her, the insulation of that state dissolved. She looked at the smoking chamber of the weapon, then at the stillness of the bodies she had scattered across the urban landscape, and realized that while the act of killing could be performed without emotion, the ownership of it could not. She had saved them, yes, but in doing so she had revealed a capacity for violence that would frighten them far more than her hesitation ever could. The silence that followed the violence was not empty. It was heavy, pressurized, and vibrating with heat. Katja remained prone behind the MK-13, her cheek pressed against the polymer stock, watching the heat waves ripple off the suppressor. The mirage distorted the air in front of the scope, turning the devastated courtyard into a shimmering, impressionist painting of gray dust and motionless bodies. She didn't move. Her shoulder throbbed with a deep, sickening ache where the rifle had hammered her repeatedly, but her breathing was controlled, shallow and rhythmic. Beside her, Tex was a wreck. The spotter was kneeling over Miller, his hands shaking so badly he could barely retape the pressure dressing. "He's out," Tex whispered, his voice cracking. "Pulse is thready. We need to move him." Katja reached up and keyed her radio. Her hand felt strange, detached, as if it belonged to someone else. "Viper Actual, this is Overwatch. Status." For 3 long seconds, there was only static. Then, the voice of Senior Chief Sledge Hayes, the platoon's second-in-command, cut through. It was breathless, thick with adrenaline and fury. "Overwatch, we are green. Casualty collection point established. Miller, say again your status." That was aggressive. "You were danger close on my point, man." Katja closed her eyes for a brief moment. They thought it was him. Of course they did. Only Miller fired that fast. Only Miller had that cadence. "Miller is down," Katja said, her voice flat. "He is critical. Catastrophic hemorrhage. Unconscious." The static hissed. "Say again?" "If Miller is down." "Who was on the gun?" "I was," Katja said. The silence that returned to the net was colder than the wind cutting through the exposed 8th floor. It wasn't the silence of tactical pause. It was the silence of judgment. "You?" Sledge's voice dropped, the anger sharpening into something distinct and dangerous. "You took 16 shots into a dynamic firefight with friendlies in the open. Are you out of your mind, Lieutenant?" "I neutralized the threats," Katja replied, her defensive instinct flaring. "The DSHK, the counter-sniper, the flankers, you're clear." "You sent 300 Win Mag rounds 2 feet over my head without a spotter and without clearance," Sledge shouted, breaking radio discipline. "You're an intel officer, not a shooter. You could have wiped out half the squad. Stand down. Do not, I repeat, do not touch that weapon again unless you are actively dying. Is that clear?" Katja stared at the dope card taped to the stock. Miller's handwriting, the neat rows of numbers she had ignored in favor of instinct. She had just saved their lives. She had done the impossible. And their reaction wasn't relief. It was outrage that she had violated the hierarchy of competence. "We have enemy trucks moving from the north," Katja said, ignoring the reprimand. "They know where the shots came from. We are burning up here. We need to move." "We are moving to the secondary extract," Sledge snapped. "Get Miller to the ground floor. We'll meet you at the alleyway. And Lieutenant, if I find out you flagged any of my guys, I'll bury you myself." The line clicked dead. Katja pulled back from the rifle. She sat up, wincing as her ribs protested. She looked at Tex. The young spotter was staring at her with a mix of awe and terror, as if she were a bomb that hadn't quite finished exploding. "He's going to kill you," Tex whispered. "Sledge, he's not going to let this slide." "Grab Miller's legs," Katja said, standing up. Her knees felt watery. "We don't have time for politics. They're bringing mortars. She looked down at the MK-13. It was heavy, long, and awkward. By rights, she should leave it. Destroy it. It was dead weight. But it was also the only thing that had kept them alive. It was evidence. And it was salvation. The rifle? Tex asked, hoisting Miller's heavy plate carrier. The Master Chief groaned, a low, unconscious sound of suffering. I'll carry it, Katja said. It weighs 15 pounds, Tex argued, struggling with Miller's bulk. You can't carry that and help me with him. I said I'll carry it. She slung the massive weapon over her back. The barrel was still hot enough to radiate warmth through her tunic. It banged against her calves as she moved to Miller's head. She grabbed the drag handle of his vest. On 3, she grunted. 1, 2, 3. They lifted. Miller was dead weight, a slab of muscle and gear that seemed to anchor them to the floor. They shuffled toward the stairwell, the dust swirling around their boots. Katja glanced back one last time at the window, at the view of the city she had just reshaped with 16 trigger pulls. The brass casings littered the floor, glinting in the gloom. 16 accusations, 16 miracles. Let's go, she said, turning her back on the light. Down into the dark. The radio remained silent as they began the descent, a void where gratitude should have been. In the special operations community, excellence is the baseline, and deviation is the enemy. To exceed expectations by breaking protocol is not heroism, it is improved instability. Katja felt the weight of the rifle digging into her spine, a physical reminder that while the results were undeniable, the method was unforgivable. She had stepped out of her designated lane, the passive, observing female officer, and entered their sacred space of violence, and she understood with a bitter clarity that they would forgive her for missing sooner than they would forgive her for being better than them. The heat radiating from the barrel wasn't just thermal energy. It was the friction of a hierarchy grinding against the truth. Gravity was an adversary as relentless as the enemy. The descent from the 8th floor had been a chaotic, stumbling nightmare of snagged gear and slick blood. By the time Katja and Tex burst out of the stairwell door and into the alleyway, their lungs were burning and their uniforms were soaked in sweat and gore. Clear right, Tex gasped, collapsing against the brickwork, letting Miller's legs drop. I need a second. Katja didn't stop. She swung the MK-13 around her body, the long barrel sweeping the shadows of the alley. She checked the corners, her eyes moving with a frantic, hyper-aware speed. No time, she hissed. We're exposed. Shapes materialized from the gloom at the end of the alley. The assault team. They moved differently now. The predatory grace was gone, replaced by the jagged urgency of men running for their lives. Senior Chief Sledge was in the lead, his face a mask of black camouflage paint and white fury. Miller, Sledge roared, ignoring tactical whispers. He dropped to his knees beside the unconscious Master Chief, ripping a fresh pressure dressing from his kit. Doc, get on him! He's pale as a sheet! The team's corpsman slid in, pushing Tex aside. Sledge looked up, his eyes locking onto Katja. Then they dropped to the rifle in her hands. The massive MK-13 looked comically large against her frame, the suppressor nearly touching the ground. Give me the weapon, Sledge commanded, holding out a hand. You're done, Lieutenant. Give it to Davis. Davis is carrying the radio and the breach kit, Katja said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her legs. And you need 4 men to carry Miller if we're going to move at speed. He's 240 pounds of dead weight. Thump. The sound was distant, a soft pop like a cork being pulled from a bottle. Mortar out! Someone yelled. Move! Sledge screamed. "Grab him! 4 corners! Let's go! Let's go!" 4 SEALs grabbed the handles of Miller's drag litter. They hoisted him up, grunting under the strain. That left Sledge, the point man, and Katja. "I said give up the gun!" Sledge snarled, stepping toward her. Crack boom. The mortar round impacted the roof of the building they had just exited. Shrapnel rained down into the alley, pinging off dumpsters and helmets. Dust billowed out, choking the narrow passage. "We are bracketed!" Katja shouted, stepping back, gripping the rifle tighter. "You need hands on the litter, Chief. If you want to argue about the rifle, we can do it when we're dead. I'm taking point." She didn't wait for his permission. She turned her back on him, a cardinal sin in the hierarchy of dominance, and sprinted to the mouth of the alley. She raised the MK-13, the heavy optic settling on the intersection ahead. "Clear!" she yelled. "Move the package!" For a fraction of a second, Sledge hesitated. Katja could feel his glare burning into her back. But the tactical reality was undeniable. They were heavy, slow, and under indirect fire. They needed guns facing out, and she was the only one not carrying a teammate or a breaching saw. "Move!" Sledge ordered, falling in beside the litter team. They ran. It was a grueling, lung-searing sprint through a labyrinth of decay. Katja led them, her boots pounding the broken pavement. The MK-13 was a beast to carry at the high port. Her arms screamed, the lactic acid building until her muscles felt like wet sand. But she didn't lower the weapon. She scanned the rooftops, the windows, the piles of trash that could hide an IED. Every intersection was a gamble. She would slide to a stop, chest heaving, sweep the street with the optic, and wave the team across. Thump! Crack! Boom! The next round landed in the street behind them, close enough that the shockwave shoved Katja forward. She stumbled, catching herself with her offhand, scraping her palm raw on the asphalt. "You keep pushing!" Sledge yelled from the rear. "Don't stop!" They were 2 blocks from the subway entrance. Miller was a pendulum of weight between the men, his boots dragging occasionally when their grip slipped. Katja could hear the wet, rattling sound of his breathing over the comms. He was drowning in his own blood. "Contact front dog!" Katja screamed. A wild dog, mangy and startled, bolted from a doorway. Katja almost pulled the trigger, her finger taking up the slack before she recognized the threat was biological, not tactical. She lowered the muzzle slightly, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Clear," she corrected, breathless. "Just a stray." "Check your targets, Bruges," Sledge barked. "Don't get twitchy on me." "I'm not twitchy," she whispered to herself. "I'm the only one looking." They reached the plaza. In the center, surrounded by the rusted hulks of burned-out cars, was the subway entrance, a black mouth leading underground. "There!" Katja pointed with the rifle barrel. "Entrance is open!" The team surged forward, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten at the sight of cover. Katja stopped at the edge of the plaza, dropping to one knee behind a concrete planter. She shouldered the rifle, providing overwatch as the team lumbered toward the stairs. She watched them go, the elite warriors, struggling under the weight of their fallen leader, reduced to pack mules by the physics of casualty evacuation. They disappeared into the dark, one by one. Sledge paused at the top of the stairs, looking back at her. "Lieutenant!" he shouted. "Collapse the formation! Get inside!" Katja fired one last look down the street. The dust from the mortar strikes was drifting toward them like a fog bank. She stood up, the rifle heavy in her hands, and ran toward the dark. The physical transfer of weight often masks a more profound transfer of responsibility. As the men took the burden of Miller's body, Katja was left carrying the burden of his violence. Running point with the heavy rifle, she realized that the weapon had ceased to be a tool and had become a badge of office she hadn't asked for. The SEALs were now dependent on her eyes and her aim to clear the path, a reversal of roles that chafed against their pride even as it saved their lives. She felt the heavy slap of the magazine against her ribs with every stride, a reminder that while they carried the man, she carried the means to keep him alive, and in the unspoken economy of the team, that debt would be the hardest one to repay. The silence of the underground was heavier than the silence of the street. It pressed against the eardrums, a thick, damp weight that smelled of stagnant water, rat droppings, and the sharp, chemical tang of ancient sewage. The transition from the chaotic noise of the mortar bombardment to this dripping tomb was jarring. "When VG's down," Sledge whispered. "Watch your footing. One slip, and Miller drops." Katja adjusted her goggles. The tunnel sprang into monochromatic green existence. The subway tracks were rusted skeletons half buried in muck. The walls were slick with condensation. She moved to the front, the long barrel of the Mk-13 scraping against the low ceiling. It was useless here, a lance in a knife fight. She slung it tight to her back and drew her FN-57 pistol. "Okay." "Gas meter is spiking," Doc hissed from the rear, glancing at the monitor clipped to Miller's litter. "Methane is at 4%. We are right on the edge, Sledge. One spark and this whole tube becomes a fuel-air bomb." "Cold weapons," Sledge ordered immediately. "Safety's on. No flashbangs. No gunfire unless I authorize it. We move fast and we move quiet." They moved like ghosts, the only sound the squelch of boots in the sludge. Katja scanned the darkness ahead, her senses dialed to the breaking point. The tunnel branched every 100 meters. Maintenance shafts, drainage overflow, collapsed stations. It was a maze designed to kill the lost. "Movement!" Katja signaled with a raised fist. She froze. Behind them, echoing down the long concrete throat of the tunnel, came voices. They were jagged, angry, speaking a dialect of Russian mixed with local slang. Beams of white light, cheap, high-lumen tactical flashlights, danced against the tunnel curves 300 meters back. "On trackers," Tex whispered. "They found the entrance." "Push forward," Sledge urged, his voice tight. "Double time." They scrambled over a pile of debris, a collapsed ceiling section that blocked half the track. Miller groaned as the litter jostled. The lights behind them got brighter. The enemy wasn't moving cautiously, they were sprinting, confident in their numbers. "They're gaining," Davis said. "Chief, we can't outrun them carrying the package. We have to make a stand." "We can't shoot," Katja reminded him, looking at the rusted pipes running along the tunnel walls. Some were hissed softly, leaking gas into the stale air. "If we engage, we incinerate ourselves." "If they catch us, they'll cut our throats," Davis countered. "I'd rather burn." "They hold," Katja said. She spotted a side junction ahead, a narrow service corridor marked with a faded, high-voltage sign. The door was gone, rotting off its hinges. "Get Miller in there," she ordered. "You're not in charge, Lieutenant!" Sledge snapped, though he was already steering the litter toward the gap. I'm buying us the gap," Katja said. She stopped in the middle of the main track. She holstered her pistol and reached into her pouch, pulling out a solitary chem light. It was red. "What are you doing?" Sledge hissed from the doorway. "Get inside." "They need a target," Katja said. She cracked the chem light. The chemical reaction glowed a dull, bloody crimson. She didn't throw it. She tied it to the trigger guard of the Mk-13 rifle on her back, then unslung the weapon. For a second she hesitated. That rifle was the reason they were alive. It was Miller's soul, but it was also just steel, She jammed the rifle bipod into the muck in the center of the track, standing the weapon up like a grotesque sentry. The red light dangled from it, a beacon in the green dark. She grabbed a handful of loose rocks and piled them around the stock to keep it upright. Then she ran. She dove into the service corridor just as the first enemy flashlight swept over the position she had abandoned. "Wait," she whispered to Sledge. "Wait for it." Through the crack in the wall, they watched. The enemy point team slowed, seeing the red glow. They shouted, raising their weapons. To them, it looked like a trap or a marker. They clustered around it, 5 men, then 10. They were arguing, their lights converging on the MK-13, standing defiant in the mud. "Now," Katja said. She reached for the rusted lever on the wall next to her, a manual release for the heavy blast door that had been designed to seal the station during air raids. It was seized with rust. "Help me," she grunted, putting her weight on it. Sledge grabbed the bar. Together, they heaved. The metal shrieked, a sound like a dying animal, and the counterweight released. The blast door didn't slam. It groaned and slid downward, a wall of steel descending to cut off the service corridor from the main tunnel. "Fire in the hole!" one of the enemy soldiers shouted in Russian. A burst of automatic gunfire erupted in the main tunnel. Someone had panicked at the screeching metal. Woof! It wasn't a sharp crack. It was a deep, atmospheric heave. The muzzle flash ignited the methane pocket pooling at the tunnel ceiling. A wave of blue and orange fire rolled down the main tunnel, expanding instantly, consuming the oxygen. The blast door slammed shut, with a thunderous clang just as the pressure wave hit. The ground shook violently. Dust rained from the ceiling of their narrow corridor. The air was sucked out of their lungs for a second, then returned, hot and smelling of ozone. "Clear," Sledge coughed, shining his light on the sealed door. It was warm to the touch. "You crazy bitch. You collapsed the main line." "I closed the door," Katja corrected, sliding down the wall to catch her breath. They provided the spark. Sledge looked at her, then at the empty space on her back where the rifle had been. "You left the gun," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. "It was heavy," Katja said, standing up and wiping the grit from her face. "And we have a boat to catch." Survival in the dark often requires the sacrifice of the very things that kept you alive in the light. By abandoning the rifle, the totem of her competence and the source of her friction with the team, Katja had performed a final, kinetic calculation. She understood that in the subterranean world of gas and shadow, a sniper rifle was just an anchor, and that sometimes the most lethal weapon is not the one you fire, but the one you leave behind to let the enemy destroy themselves. As they turned to move deeper into the service shaft, lighter but defenseless, the silence returned, no longer heavy with threat, but hollow with the finality of what had just burned on the other side of the steel. The transition from the suffocating darkness of the tunnels to the open air of the riverbank was a shock to the system. The air here was sharp, freezing, and smelled of diesel and rotting vegetation. They emerged from a rusted drainage pipe that spilled out onto a vast, flat expanse of mud leading down to the black water of the river. Perimeter," Sledge whispered, his voice barely audible over the lap of the water. "Keep low in the reeds. We are thermal beacons out here." Katja slid down the embankment, the mud sucking at her boots. She scanned the far bank and the looming silhouette of the suspension bridge 2 kilometers to the north. It was still dark, but the sky to the east was bleeding a bruised purple. Dawn was coming, and with it, death. "Comms are up," Davis hissed, shielding the handset of the radio. "Viking is 2 mics out. They need a signal." "Pop the strobe," Sledge ordered. Katja reached into her pouch and pulled out the M2000 strobe. She twisted the cap to activate the IR filter, then extended the blue shield. To the naked eye, it was invisible. Under night vision, it would pulse like a frantic lighthouse. She placed it on a flat rock near the water's edge, angling it downstream. "Signal set," she said. Behind her, in the reeds, there was a sudden thrashing. "Miller, hold him down!" Tex's voice was a panicked whisper. Katja turned. Master Chief Miller was awake. The shock of the cold air or the jostling of the litter had pulled him back from the gray edge of unconsciousness. He was struggling, his legs kicking weakly in the mud, his good hand grasping at his chest, at the empty air, at the ground beside him. "Where?" Miller croaked, his voice wet and ruinous. "Where is—" Katja crawled over to him. His eyes were wild, dilated, darting frantically around the gathering of men. He looked at Sledge, then at Tex, and finally locked onto Katja. "Why, my gun!" Miller gasped, trying to sit up, only to be pushed back down by the corpsman. "Where is, the MK-13? The silence that fell over the team was louder than the river. Sledge looked away, checking the bridge. Tex bit his lip. "Lie down, Chief," Katja said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We're extracting." Miller slapped her hand away. It was a weak, clumsy strike, but the anger behind it was focused. "Where is it, Lieutenant?" "It's gone, Jonas," Katja said, using his first name for the first time. "I left it in the tunnel." Miller stopped struggling. He stared at her, his brain trying to process the impossibility of the statement. For a sniper, the rifle is not equipment. It is an extension of the self. To leave it behind is a mutilation. "You left it?" he wheezed, spit flying from his lips. You left my rifle." "We needed a decoy," Katja said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "It was the only way to seal the blast door. It's buried under 1,000 tons of concrete." "You had no right," Miller whispered, tears of rage and weakness pooling in his eyes. "You had no right to touch it. You had no right to leave it." "I saved your life," Katja said. "I didn't ask you to," Miller snarled, grabbing her vest and pulling her down until their faces were inches apart. "I didn't ask you to be a hero, Bruges. I asked you to stay in the truck." "Contact! Boat!" Davis yelled. The roar of twin diesel engines shattered the conversation. Around the bend of the river, a dark shape tore through the water, throwing up a massive rooster tail of spray. It was a SOCR, a Special Operations Craft, Riverine. It was moving fast, banking hard toward the mudflat. "Thermal on the bridge!" Sledge shouted. "They see the boat! Taking fire!" From the distant bridge, tracers began to arc down toward the river like angry red hornets. The water around the incoming boat erupted in geysers. The SOCR didn't slow down. The forward minigunner spun up his weapon, a terrifying electric buzz followed by a solid stream of fire that lashed out at the bridge, a chainsaw of light cutting through the dark. "Move! Move! Move!" Sledge screamed. They grabbed the litter. Miller was still shouting, delirious now, cursing Katja, cursing the mud, cursing the sky. They dragged him through the freezing sludge, the water rushing into their boots. The boat slammed its bow into the mudbank, engines reversing hard to hold position. The crew chief on the bow was screaming, waving them on. "Load the package!" They heaved Miller over the gunwale. Hands grabbed him, pulling him onto the diamond plate deck. Katja scrambled up behind him, slipping on the wet metal. She fell onto the deck just as the pilot gunned the throttles. The boat lurched backward, spinning around. Katja looked back at the shore. The mudflat was empty, save for the IR strobe pulsing invisibly in the dark. And then the rounds found them. Ping, ping, ping. Bullets hammered the armor plating of the boat. Katja curled into a ball next to Miller, covering his head with her body as the miniguns roared above them, answering the threat with a deafening wall of noise. The boat surged forward, picking up speed, tearing away from the city, away from the tunnels, and away from the tomb where the borrowed rifle lay rusting in the dark. She looked down at Miller. He had passed out again, his face slack, his hand still clutching at the ghost of the sling that wasn't there. There is a singular, bitter intimacy in saving a man who despises you for the method of his salvation. As the boat cut through the black water, putting distance between the team and the ruin of their mission, Katja lay on the vibrating deck and realized that the extraction was physical, not moral. She had brought them all back, breathing and whole, but she had left the symbol of their brotherhood buried in the dark. To Miller, the rifle was a legacy. To her, it was a transaction. The price paid for the breath in his lungs. She watched the wake of the boat churn the river into white foam and understood that she would never be forgiven for the competence that allowed her to make that trade. For there is no greater insult to a warrior than to be saved by the one he deemed unworthy of the fight. The interrogation room was cleaner than the operating theater where they had stitched Miller back together, and somehow it felt more sterile. There were no windows. The air conditioning hummed with an aggressive chill that made the sweat drying on Katja's uniform feel like ice. She sat at a metal table, her hands clasped in front of her, knuckles white. Across from her sat Major Kincaid, a JAG officer with eyes like flint and a stack of files that looked like an indictment. "Let's review the timeline again, Lieutenant," Kincaid said, not looking up from his papers. "At 0355, Master Chief Miller is incapacitated. At 0356, you assume control of his weapon system. Is that correct?" "I assumed control of the sector defense," Katja corrected, her voice steady. "The weapon was the tool required for that defense." Kincaid finally looked up. "Semantics. You took a MK-13 sniper rifle, a weapon you are not qualified on, not issued, and specifically ordered not to touch by the element leader. And you engaged targets in a dynamic environment with friendlies downrange. I neutralized the threats that were killing those friendlies," Katja said. Kincaid sighed, a long, weary sound. He tapped a tablet on the table, waking the screen. "We have Master Chief Miller's affidavit. He gave it from his hospital bed this morning. Would you like to hear his recollection?" Katja didn't answer. She didn't have to. Kincaid pressed play. Miller's voice filled the small room. It was raspy, weak, stripped of its usual boom, but the bitterness was intact. "I didn't give the order. I told her to stand down. She panicked. She grabbed the gun while I was bleeding out. I tried to stop her. She was frantic, unstable. I thought she was going to shoot my guys." The recording clicked off. "Frantic," Kincaid repeated. "Unstable. That's the official record from the ground force commander." "He was in hypovolemic shock," Katja said, fighting the urge to stand up. "He was delirious. He was trying to protect his rifle because he couldn't accept that he was out of the fight." "And Senior Chief Hayes?" Kincaid asked, sliding another paper forward. "Sledge's statement corroborates Miller. He says he heard you on the net, claiming control, but he had no visual. He says the shots were erratic and danger close." "They were effective," Katja snapped. "Is there a casualty report for the assault team? Did any of them die after 0356? "No," Kincaid admitted. "But luck isn't a defense, Lieutenant. The UCMJ frowns on rolling the dice with live ammunition. It wasn't luck." Kincaid leaned back, crossing his arms. He studied her for a long moment, as if trying to solve a math problem that didn't add up. Then he reached into the folder and pulled out a glossy, high-resolution photograph. He slid it across the table. It was an aerial reconnaissance photo taken by a drone the morning after the extraction. It showed the courtyard of the warlord's compound. There were red circles drawn around specific points. 16 shots, Kincaid said quietly. We recovered 16 casings from the 8th floor, and we found 16 impacts downrange. Head, chest, hip, engine block. RPG tube, he tapped the photo. The ballistic analysis is confusing, Lieutenant. These hits are consistent with a Tier 1 operator having a good day. They are not consistent with a frantic intel officer borrowing a gun she's never zeroed. The wind was steady, Katja said, using the same line she had used in the cold open, the words tasting like ash. Miller says you missed, Kincaid pressed. He says you were spraying and praying, but the bodies don't lie, and that's the problem. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping. If I accept your version, it means a Belgian support officer outshot a Navy SEAL Master Chief with his own gun. If I accept his version, you're a reckless liability who got lucky. Politically, Lieutenant? The Navy prefers the second story. It's cleaner. It protects the brand. So I'm being court-martialed for saving them? You're being investigated for gross insubordination and misappropriation of sensitive equipment, Kincaid said, closing the file. The investigation is formal as of now. You are confined to base. You will not contact the team. You will not speak to the press. And for God's sake, stay away from the hospital. Katja looked at the photo of the courtyard one last time. The red circles looked like a constellation of violence, a map of the moment she had been perfect. You have the data, she said, standing up. You know what happened. I know what the bullets did, Kincaid said, standing as well. But I also know how this machine works. You bruised the ego of the wrong unit, Lieutenant. Truth is just the first casualty. The institutional memory of a military unit is not a record of facts, but a curated mythology of competence. When an outsider performs a feat that belongs to the tribe's lore, the system reacts not with applause, but with rejection. As Katja walked out of the debriefing room, leaving the undeniable photo on the table, she realized that her accuracy had been her error. By hitting every target, she had stripped Miller and his men of the excuse of chaos. She had proven that the shot was possible, just not by them. She understood then that she was not being punished for the risk she took, but for the devastating clarity of her success, which had turned their hierarchy of skill into a lie they now had to bury. The dining facility, DFAC, at the forward operating base was a cavernous tent that smelled of reconstituted eggs, floor wax, and aggressive apathy. It was the social vascular system of the base, the place where rumors circulated and hierarchies were displayed in the geometry of seating arrangements. For Lieutenant Katja Maes, it was a gauntlet. She entered the tent alone. The noise inside, the clatter of plastic trays, the low roar of conversation, the hiss of the serving line didn't stop, but the tenor of it shifted. It was a subtle, frequency-level drop that rippled outward from the door as she walked in. Heads turned, then quickly turned back. Eyes met hers and slid away, glassing over with deliberate non-recognition. She was a ghost. Or worse, she was a virus. Katja moved through the line, her movements mechanical. She took a tray. She took a carton of milk. She took the gray slab of meat the server slapped onto her plate. She didn't look at the server. She felt the weight of the stairs boring into her back, a physical pressure that made the skin between her shoulder blades itch. Keep your head up. Don't let them see you flinch. She scanned the room for a seat. The SEAL platoon, Miller's men, claimed 3 tables near the center. They were a phalanx of tan t-shirts and bearded jawlines, laughing too loudly, eating with the voracious energy of men who had cheated death. Sledge sat at the head of the center table, holding court. He didn't look at her, but his posture, stiff, shoulders squared to the door, told her he knew exactly where she was. She stepped toward an empty seat at a table occupied by a few support clerks. As she approached, two of them suddenly stood up, grabbing their trays. "Finished," one muttered, not making eye contact. They left before she could set her tray down. Katja sat. The plastic chair scraped loudly against the plywood floor. She was alone in a sea of 300 people. The empty chairs around her formed a quarantine zone. The message was clear. You are not one of us. You are the Blue Falcon, the buddy fucker, the one who broke the code. She picked up her fork. Her hand trembled slightly. She clamped it down on the table, forcing it still. The injustice of it burned in her throat, hotter than the bile rising from her stomach. She had saved them. She had watched over them when they were blind and helpless. And because she had done it by breaking their rules, by showing up their idol, they were trying to erase her. She forced herself to eat. One bite, chew, swallow. It tasted like cardboard. A shadow fell over her table. Katja stiffened, her hand drifting instinctively to a hip that no longer held a pistol. She looked up. It was Davis, the young driver from the infiltration, the kid who had been trapped in the wreck with her. He was holding a tray of dirty dishes, pausing on his way to the scullery. He didn't stop walking, but he slowed down just enough as he passed her isolated island. He looked toward Sledge's table to ensure no one was watching. Then he looked down at her. His eyes were wide, frightened, and fleeting. "My dope card," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the din. "It was wrong. I checked it after." Katja frowned, confused. "What?" "The wind," Davis mumbled, pretending to adjust his grip on the tray. Miller's card said full value, but in the courtyard, the wind was swirling. If you had used his numbers, you would have missed the RPG guy. He glanced nervously at Sledge's back. "You didn't use the card," Davis said, a flicker of awe breaking through his fear. "You just knew." "More Davis!" Sledge's voice cracked like a whip from the center table. "Stop fraternizing and move your ass." Davis flinched. The mask of indifference slammed back down. "Aye, Senior Chief." He hurried away, disappearing into the noise of the kitchen. Katja sat there, the fork hovering halfway to her mouth. The revelation hit her with the force of a physical blow. They knew. Davis knew. The math proved it. If she had followed the correct procedure, if she had obeyed the hierarchy and used the Master Chief's data, the team would be dead. Her recklessness, her refusal to use the bad data, was the only reason Davis was alive to bus his tray. She looked over at Sledge. The Senior Chief was laughing at a joke, but his eyes flicked toward her, cold and hard. He knew it too. That was why they were freezing her out. Not because she was wrong, but because she was right in a way that humiliated them. Katja took another bite of the gray meat. This time she tasted it. She swallowed. She wasn't just a victim of their politics anymore. She was the keeper of a truth they were terrified of. The mechanics of ostracization are designed to induce doubt, to make the individual question their reality against the consensus of the group. But validation, even when whispered, acts as an anchor. Katja sat in the hollow center of the mess hall, the noise of the exclusion washing over her, but the isolation no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a fortress. By acknowledging the technical reality of the shot, the swirling wind, the bad data, the instinctual correction, Davis had inadvertently handed her the key to her own sanity. She realized then that the silence of the platoon wasn't a punishment for her failure. It was a desperate, collective attempt to drown out the sound of her competence. The conference room was a study in mahogany and silence, a stark contrast to the dust and blood of the tunnels. At the head of the long table sat Rear Admiral Holloway, a man whose face was etched with the kind of lines that came from making decisions that killed people he would never meet. To his right was Major Kincaid, the JAG officer. To his left, a civilian in a gray suit who hadn't introduced himself but smelled of the State Department. "Sit down, Lieutenant," Holloway said. His voice was not unkind, which terrified Katja more than Miller's screaming ever had. Katja took the seat at the far end of the table. She was wearing her dress uniform, the Belgian insignia catching the light. She felt small in the room, an aesthetic anomaly in the monolithic machinery of the U.S. Navy. "We have a problem, Lieutenant Maes," Holloway began, sliding a folder across the polished wood. "The ballistic analysis is complete. It confirms everything you said. 16 shots, 16 impacts, 0 collateral damage to non-combatants." Katja stiffened. "Then the investigation is closed, Admiral?" "Not quite," the civilian spoke up. He tapped a finger on the table. "Target number 12, the man with the RPG. Do you know who that was? He was an enemy combatant engaging a U.S. Navy SEAL team with a rocket-propelled grenade," Katja stated flatly. "He was also Ibrahim Al-Fayed," the civilian said, "a key intermediary for the agency. We were cultivating him. He was supposed to be the off-ramp for this conflict. His presence in the courtyard was a failure of deconfliction, yes, but his death creates a crater in our diplomatic strategy for the region." Katja looked from the civilian to the admiral. The trap was revealing itself. "If Master Chief Miller had taken that shot," Holloway said, leaning forward, "we could classify it as fog of war. Miller is a known quantity, a Tier 1 asset. The host nation accepts that accidents happen when the big dogs eat. But you?" He gestured to her. "A foreign liaison officer? Commandeering a weapon? Acting unilaterally? That looks like a rogue assassination. That looks like an international incident." "I saved the team," Katja said, her voice rising slightly. "If I hadn't taken that shot, Target 12 would have vaporized 5 of your men." "We know," Holloway said softly. "But the narrative, Lieutenant. We have to manage the narrative." Kincaid opened the file in front of him. "Here is the deal, Lieutenant. We can't have a hero who broke the rules and killed a CIA asset. It's messy. So we have 2 options." He held up one finger. "Option A. We proceed with the court-martial. You defend yourself. You bring up the bad wind call. You bring up Miller's incapacitation. You prove you were right. You win, maybe. But in doing so, you publicly humiliate a Master Chief with 20 years of service. You expose the unit's failure, and you embarrass the U.S. Navy in front of our NATO partners. We will burn you on the back end. Your career will be over." He held up a second finger. "Option B. You sign this statement." He slid a single sheet of paper toward her. "It says that due to a communications breakdown and extreme duress, you acted outside of the established ROE. It frames the engagement as a procedural error, rather than a tactical decision. You accept a letter of reprimand. You are immediately repatriated to Belgium. The file on the mission is sealed. Miller keeps his reputation. The diplomatic fallout is handled quietly as an internal matter." Katja looked at the paper. It was a confession of incompetence. It framed her 88 seconds of perfection as a panic-induced accident. "You want me to lie," she said. "I want you to be a professional," Holloway countered. "You saved their lives, Katja. Do you want to save their dignity too?" Or do you want to be the one who destroys Master Chief Miller to prove a point? Katja thought of Davis in the mess hall. The wind was swirling. She had the card to play. She could prove Miller was wrong, that his experience would have gotten them killed. She could destroy the myth of the infallible SEAL. But if she did that, she destroyed the unit. She would leave them leaderless and broken, their trust in their own hierarchy shattered. She had saved their bodies in the courtyard. Now she had to decide if their cohesive soul was worth her own honor. She looked at the Admiral. She picked up the pen. Miller gets to keep his trident? She asked. Sudden Miller retires with honors, Holloway confirmed, and the team stays intact. Katja wrote her name. The ink flowed smoothly, signing away the truth of the greatest shooting of her life. She pushed the paper back to Kincaid. I'm ready to go home, Admiral, she said. The Admiral nodded, a look of genuine respect flickering in his eyes before he masked it. Dismissed, Lieutenant. There is a specific weight to a silence bought with pride. It is heavier than steel, denser than lead. As Katja walked out of the conference room, leaving behind the signed confession that branded her a liability, she understood that the ultimate test of a soldier is not the ability to kill, but the ability to die a social death for the sake of the mission. She had neutralized the enemy with a rifle, and now she had neutralized the political threat with her signature, accepting that in the official history of the war, she would be a footnote of error, while the men she saved would remain the heroes of the chapter. She adjusted her uniform, feeling the phantom recoil of the MK-13 in her shoulder, and walked toward the exit, carrying the secret of her competence like a concealed weapon that she would never draw again. The tarmac smelled of burnt kerosene and impending rain. Katja stood by the loading ramp of the C-130 Hercules, her duffel bag heavy on her shoulder, watching the ground crew rush through the pre-flight checks. She was leaving as a liability, a procedural error on a piece of paper that was already filed in a vault in the Pentagon. The engines of the transport plane whined, a high-pitched scream that masked the sound of the siren until it was too late. Whoomp! Schautetzrilo, the first rocket impacted the fuel depot 300 meters to the east. The shock wave rolled across the tarmac, invisible and violent, knocking the ground crew off their feet. A massive fireball mushroomed into the twilight sky, painting the belly of the clouds in frantic orange. Incoming! Incoming! The loadmaster shoved Katja back toward the concrete barriers. Get to the bunker! Before she could move, the perimeter fence near the main gate dissolved. A garbage truck, reinforced with welded steel plates, smashed through the barriers and detonated. The explosion was absolute, a concussive erasure of the gate guard post. Complex attack, the PA system blared. All hands, sector north. Breach! Breach! Katja dropped her bag. She looked at the C-130, her ticket out of this hell, and then she looked at the smoke rising from the north perimeter. The base security forces were scrambling, but the volume of fire pouring through the breach was overwhelming. Tracers zipped through the air like angry fireflies. She didn't run to the bunker. She ran toward the wall. She found the defensive line in chaos. A mixture of support staff, cooks, and a handful of operators were pouring fire into the breach. The enemy was swarming, fighters with suicide vests sprinting toward the hangars. Suppress them! Keep them off the flight line! Katja slid into a sandbag emplacement. To her right, a figure was struggling to mount a weapon. It was Master Chief Miller. He was wearing a hospital gown tucked into combat pants, his left arm bound tight to his chest in a complex sling, his neck bandaged. He was trying to prop his MK-13 sniper rifle, the rifle, onto the sandbags with one hand, his face a rictus of pain and frustration. He couldn't do it. He couldn't stabilize the fore-end and work the bolt with one good arm. The recoil would tear his stitches apart. Miller! Katja shouted over the roar of a saw gunner next to them. Miller looked up. His eyes were feverish, glazed with painkillers but sharp with adrenaline. He saw her, the woman he had disparaged, the officer he had officially condemned in his affidavit, the error he had let take the fall. He looked at the breach. A technical with a mounted gun was tearing through the smoke, heading straight for their position. I can't. Miller gritted out, the admission tearing at his soul. I can't hold it. Katja didn't ask for permission this time. She didn't hesitate. She slid into the position beside him, her shoulder brushing his good one. Give me the gun, Jonas, she said. Miller looked at her. The investigation was over. The lie was signed. She was supposed to be incompetent. But the technical was 200 meters out and closing. He shoved the rifle toward her. Katja settled behind the stock. It felt different now. Familiar. She pulled it into her shoulder, the polymer biting into the bruise that was still healing from the mission. She racked the bolt. Distance, she demanded. Miller didn't argue. He grabbed his binoculars, leaning against the sandbags, transforming instantly from a broken shooter into a world-class spotter. Target is the technical, Miller barked, his voice finding its old command resonance. Range 210, moving speed, left to right. Wind? Katja asked, centering the crosshairs on the driver's slit. Miller hesitated for a fraction of a second. He looked at the flags whipping on the flight line. He looked at the smoke drifting across the runway. We're full value left, Miller said. Then he corrected himself. No. Gusting. Hold left edge. Trust the gust. It was an admission, a validation. He was giving her the real data, not the book data. Katja held the left edge of the driver's window. She exhaled. The world narrowed down to the vibrating image in the scope. The politics, the lies, the JAG officer, the shame, it all vanished. There was only the trigger brake. Crack, the rifle kicked. Impact, Miller called. Driver dead, vehicle slewing. The technical swerved violently, flipping onto its side and skidding into a fuel truck. The explosion lit up the night. Infantry in the open, Miller shouted. 3 targets, reference the burning tire. I see them, Katja said. She worked the bolt. Rack, push, squeeze. Crack, hit, crack, hit, crack, hit. They worked in perfect lethal sympathy. The Belgian lieutenant and the American master chief united by the mechanics of violence. For 10 minutes, they held the corner of the airfield. Miller called the wind, reading the subtle shifts in the air with a master's eye, and Katja delivered the payload with a surgeon's hand. There was no friction, no ego, only the terrifying efficiency of 2 professionals doing the only thing they knew how to do. When the QRF finally rolled through the breach and the firing died down, the silence that followed was heavy with the smell of cordite. Katja cleared the chamber, catching the final brass casing in her hand. She looked at Miller. He was slumped against the sandbags, exhausted, his hospital gown stained with fresh blood where his stitches had pulled. He looked at the rifle in her hands, then up at her face. You hold left edge, Miller whispered, his voice raspy. You always hold left edge, only when it's gusting, Katja replied. She handed him the rifle. He took it with his good hand, the weight of it settling between them. He didn't say thank you. He didn't apologize for the investigation. He just nodded, a single sharp dip of his chin. Get on the plane, Bruges, Miller said, looking away toward the burning wreck of the technical. Before someone realizes you're actually good at this. Reconciliation in the profession of arms rarely comes in the form of an apology. It comes in the form of ammunition shared and targets designated. As Katja walked away from the defensive line, her hands stained with carbon and oil for the last time, She realized that the signed confession and the sealed file were irrelevant. The paper said she was a liability, but the heat radiating from the barrel in Miller's lap said she was a peer. She boarded the plane not as a failure fleeing judgment, but as a warrior who had forced the gods of the unit to spot for her, proving that while they could strip her of her rank and her reputation, they could never strip her of the wind. The rain in Brussels was different from the rain in the deployment zone. It was cold, persistent, and polite, washing the cobblestones of the Grand Place until they shone like polished hematite. Lieutenant Katja Maes sat at a small iron table outside a cafe, sheltered by an awning, watching the tourists drift by. They were consuming the city, eating waffles, taking selfies in front of the guild halls, complaining about the damp. They lived in the fairy tale Miller had mocked. Oblivious to the wolves at the perimeter, she took a sip of her coffee. It was scalded, bitter, and lacked the metallic tang of fear she had grown accustomed to. 2 hours ago, she had stood in the office of Colonel de Smet at the Belgian Defense Ministry. The meeting had been brief, clinical, and suffocated by the things left unsaid. De Smet had slid a small velvet box across his desk, not meeting her eyes. For service rendered during Operation Obsidian, he had said. The Americans sent a commendation. It cites exceptional administrative support under hazardous conditions. Administrative support. Katja had opened the box. Inside was a generic NATO service medal, the kind given for showing up and not getting arrested. It was a ribbon for participation, not a decoration for valor. The file is sealed, Lieutenant, de Smet had added, seeing the tightening of her jaw. The incident with the borrowed equipment has been expunged from your permanent record, provided you adhere to the non-disclosure agreement. As far as the Belgian military is concerned, you were an intelligence liaison who assisted in logistics. Do you understand? I understand, Colonel, she had replied. It's better this way, de Smet said, though he didn't sound convinced. Heroes are expensive, Maes. Problems are cheap if you bury them. Now, watching a group of teenagers laugh as they tried to fit under a single umbrella, Katja fingered the small, crumpled piece of paper in her coat pocket. She pulled it out. It wasn't the citation. It wasn't the reprimand. It was a torn corner of a waterproof notebook she had salvaged from her tack vest before turning it in. On it, written in grease pencil, were a series of numbers, windholds, drop charts, and at the bottom, a hasty scrawl in a different handwriting, Miller's heavy, blocky script from that final night on the airfield sandbags. Trust the gust. She smoothed the paper out on the table. This was the only proof. The official record said she was a clerk who panicked. The medal said she was a participant, but this scrap of paper, stained with oil and grit, said she was a shooter. It was the receipt for 16 lives ended in defense of 16 others. It was the physical evidence that for 88 seconds, and then again for 10 minutes on a burning runway, she had been the deadliest thing in the valley. A waiter appeared, collecting her empty cup. He looked at the paper on the table, then at her. He saw a woman in a gray wool coat, scarred knuckles, staring at a list of numbers. "Working on your taxes, madame?" he asked pleasantly. Katja looked up. The urge to correct him, to explain that those numbers represented the terminal ballistics of a 300 Winchester Magnum round at 1,000 meters, rose in her throat. She could tell him. She could tell him about the heat of the barrel, the smell of Miller's blood, the way the DSHK gunner had evaporated, the way the fairy tale was paid for in red currency. She looked at the tourists. She looked at the guild halls. "Something like that," she said quietly, "just balancing the books." The waiter nodded and walked away. Katja folded the paper. She didn't put it back in her pocket. She held it over the candle burning in the center of the table. The flame licked the edge, curling the waterproof coating. The grease pencil numbers turned to black smoke. She watched it burn until the heat touched her fingertips, then dropped the ash into the ashtray. It was gone. The proof was ash. The story was smoke. She stood up, buttoning her coat against the wind. The city was gray and beautiful and safe. Miller was somewhere in a hospital in Germany, keeping his trident and his pride. The SEALs were back in the dark, doing what they did, and she was here, walking the streets of Bruges, invisible. She wasn't the hero of the story. She wasn't the villain. She was the mechanic who had fixed the engine when it broke and wiped her hands clean before the passengers noticed the stall. Katja turned her collar up and stepped out from the awning. She merged into the crowd, her stride long and purposeful. She didn't need the medal. She didn't need the recognition. She knew the weight of the rifle, and she knew the truth of the wind. That was enough. The true burden of the unsung hero is not the lack of applause, but the necessity of silence. To protect the world, one must often accept being misunderstood by it. As Katja vanished into the gray drizzle of the city she had defended from the shadows, she finally understood that the borrowed rifle was never really about the weapon itself. It was about the agency to make the hard choice when the designated saviors had fallen. She walked with the quiet, terrifying confidence of a woman who knows exactly what she is capable of, content to let the world believe she is harmless, because she knows that the peace they enjoy is the shadow cast by her decision to pull the trigger. The myth of the hero often demands a clean narrative: the rightful warrior, the authorized weapon, the sanctioned victory. But the reality of survival is rarely clean. It is messy, improvised, and often relies on the person in the room whom everyone else has underestimated. The Bruges Protocol is not just a story about shooting. It is a dissection of competence in a system that values hierarchy over results. Katja Maes represents the thousands of service members who step into the void left by failure, do the unthinkable to save the day, and then are asked to disappear because their success is an embarrassment to the established order. The hard truth is that institutions often punish the anomaly of excellence to preserve the comfort of the status quo. Real leadership is recognizing that the right person for the shot isn't always the one with the right rank, but the one with the nerve to take it. We walk among these silent guardians every day, people who have carried the weight of the world for a few seconds, and then quietly put it down, expecting nothing in return but the right to keep walking. If Katja's silence resonated with you, or if you've ever had to do the hard work while others took the credit, I'm here to explore those stories further. The file is sealed, but we can always open another.